Chapter 23 of Stephen Mitchell's Journey by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23 Blocking the Track. Before they went home that night, it had been arranged that there should be, on the following Friday evening, a religious service in the Mitchell dining room, and Stephen had promised to tell any neighbor who passed that way, or with whom he came in contact, and give the invitation. "It is out of my line," he said with an awkward smile, avoiding the minister's earnest eyes as he spoke, "but then I suppose I can do it." "I do not wonder that you are fond of Mrs. Colchester, Helen," the minister said as they rode home in the moonlight. "She is very pleasant and winning in her manner." And Helen, like the wise woman that she was, resisted the temptation to say, "I thought you would discover that there were other women in the world beside Gertrude Temple," and held her peace. The winter, which a few months before had seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of Mr. Ransom, passed as if by magic. He was so absorbed in his work, and there was so much work to be done, that he had no time to regret the holidays when they were fairly upon him, although he had regretted them much in anticipation, because of the contrast in his life with that of a year ago. He even forgot the date of the last letter he wrote to Gertrude Temple, and was so absorbed in preparations for the Christmas tree for the Hilton Hill Sunday School, that he forgot to recall how he was occupied just a year before, till some chance remark of Helen's suggested that time, and then he smiled, somewhat sadly it is true, over what he had taught himself to call his blighted past, but the next minute he responded to Stephen Mitchell's call for help in fastening up the evergreen over the west window, and forgot all about it. By this time you know that a Sunday school was started in the Hilton Hill neighborhood, and I may as well tell you now that it was a success. Even Sarah Jane Mitchell, who thought she knew the neighborhood well, declared one day that she didn't see where the children came from. They seemed to spring up in the night. As for the meetings started in the Mitchell dining room, who shall tell what they had wrought? "From the very first," Mr. Ransom said, speaking of them with deep feeling to an intimate friend long afterward, "from the very first the Lord seemed to smile upon that effort. Do you remember how surprised we were over the number who came the first night? And what a joy it was to hear Mrs. Mitchell break the timid silence of years and pray before them all. And how wonderful it was when Flora Ann came to a knowledge of herself, and gave the wealth of her heart's love to Jesus." Oh, they were weeks to remember! And the interest, instead of dying out as the spring drew near, seemed steadily to increase. Not only had the Sunday school been started, but a reading circle was organized, and a young people's club that had the temperance pledge for its center, which pledge was signed by some who were least expected to take that stand. In short, as Fanny Bascom put it, "That stony old Hilton Hill neighborhood has become the fashion. If you don't go out there to their prayer meetings and clubs, and I don't know what all, you don't amount to anything." But despite all the good that had been wrought, there was no denying the fact that some who had been prayed for most earnestly, and reached after with most persistent effort, failed to be moved. Among these was Stephen Mitchell, the minister's special care and anxiety. "I am greatly disappointed," Mr. Ransom said to Mrs. Colchester. "In fact, I may as well own that my faith has gotten a setback. I confidently looked for him as a first fruit. He interested me from the first time I ever spoke with him, and seemed fairly started on the road toward a better life even then." "He is improving very rapidly," said Mrs. Colchester. "Sarah makes good progress, and so indeed does Flora, but they are both slow compared with him. You would be surprised, Mr. Ransom, to see how rapidly he acquires that which he has set his mind upon learning, which is, by the way, the explanation of your disappointment. He has set his mind and heart upon acquiring knowledge in certain directions. Something or someone has roused in him the determination to become a skilled farmer, and everything agricultural, or anything which will tend toward agricultural knowledge, is seized upon with avidity. If the book or the person, whoever it was, who started him in this direction, could have laid the other foundation first, Stephen would have been won for Christ before now. Then the minister looked at her in a startled, troubled way. He remembered his first walk with Stephen when they went across lots to the Lucas place. He remembered distinctly the conversation which had been carried on. A few words he spoke for Christ at that time, surely he did. But he recalled with humiliation and pain that his special effort had been to arouse in Stephen an ambition to reconstruct the old farm, which had been for years so nearly a failure. The foundation work had been his. He knew he was responsible for having started Stephen in the direction in which he was pressing. He tried to find comfort in the thought of the sermon which he had preached, using Stephen's words. Certainly then he had tried very hard to lead the young man to a sense of his need of Jesus Christ, and the importance of making that the first work. Yes, but the first impression was evidently the stronger, and the first impression had been made in another direction. That evening the minister went home troubled at heart. But if Stephen Mitchell had been called as a witness, and had been honest with himself, he would have owned that enough had been said to lead him to understand fully the importance of choosing Christ as his leader in the new life journey he meant to take. He was simply another illustration of the power which is at work in the world, keeping people away from the road which they ought to travel, setting their wills against the decision which they ought to make. Stephen Mitchell could not have explained, even to his own satisfaction, why he was so persistent in his determination to avoid all decisions of this kind, why he should listen to Mr. Ransom's sermons with a view to getting every bit of information out of them which they could give, and shut his heart determinately against any call to himself, why he accepted, at Mrs. Colchester's gracious hand, assistance in writing, in reading, in the study of words, in the construction of sentences, and was grateful for it all, but turned from her almost rudely the moment she attempted to speak a word for the Master whom she served. Why he met Sarah Jane halfway in all her improvements in the home and in her plans for future development, but told her gruffly not to preach when she asked him if he had read the verse on the card which she had given him, and if he didn't think it was about something which ought to be looked after. Nay, he even turned coldly away from his mother one night, after she had prayed for her children in the prayer meeting, and told her heartlessly, when she questioned him as to what was the matter, that he didn't care about being prayed at. He thought folks better keep such things to themselves. Oh, there was no question but that Stephen's conscience was enlightened enough, and was being very much wrought upon. It was his stubborn will which was blocking the track. "I don't understand him," said Sarah Jane frankly to Miss Ransom. "He isn't a bit as I thought he would be. Why, the first time the thing dawned upon me that I could have the Lord Jesus Christ for my friend, I was happy enough to shout. Do you remember when it was? I was at your house that first 3 weeks, and I wanted to come home right away and tell Steve about it. I thought I would only have to tell him how it was, and he would take hold of it. I never once thought that he would hang back from such a chance as that." There was another who hung back from all the chances which might have redeemed his wrecked life. That was Jake Lucas. Despite all their invitations and appeals, he had not once attended the neighborhood prayer meetings, nor been inside the little red schoolhouse after the Sunday services were established there. Others of the Lucas family had been reached, and in a measure helped. The little girls came regularly to Sabbath school, and were learning outward propriety of behavior at least. Miranda was quite a frequent attendant at the afternoon service, and occasionally came to the midweek prayer meeting, and was at least respectful when spoken to as to her personal interest or responsibility. Mrs. Colchester felt sure that she was thinking. Even poor, worthless Jim had lounged in once or twice of a Sunday afternoon when he was less intoxicated than usual, and had admitted to Flora Ann that the singing was fine, and that maybe some time or other, when he felt like it, he would come again. And the poor old mother, weighed down with the sorrows of many years of disappointment and ill treatment, found a refuge at last, and crept into it like a bruised soul in dire need of shelter. But Jake would have none of it, would not even answer when asked to the meeting, growled at his mother, and swore at Miranda for having anything to do with the canting hypocrites, and threatened at last to knock the breath out of Flora Ann's body if she ever opened her head to him about any of them things again, and in short, steadily grew worse and worse. As the spring opened, it seemed folly to invite him to come to the meetings, for he was rarely ever sober enough for them to have been of any avail. "I am afraid," said the minister with a long-drawn sigh, "I am afraid Jake is a hopeless case. That miserable Jim and the other one may possibly be reached. They are better natured naturally than Jake. I have even hopes at times of the old sod of a father, but I confess that it requires more faith to pray for Jake than I seem able to exercise." "There is one who will pray for him as long as she has breath, I think," Helen said with a grave smile. "The tenacity with which she holds on to that worthless brother is remarkable. He is more cruel to her than he is to any of the others. Mrs. Mitchell confided to me last week that she hated to have the girl go home because her brother abused her so." It was all true. Flora Ann's bloodshot eye or bruised arm often told silently and eloquently the story of her wrongs, yet she prayed on. Perhaps there was hardly one of the group for whom the winter had done more than it had for Flora. She was wonderfully changed. Wholesome food, and enough of it, eaten at regular intervals, had rounded out her form and made her less hollow-eyed and hungry-looking. Then her dress, though very poor and plain, of course, was always scrupulously neat nowadays, and Mrs. Colchester began to see to it that on Sundays and extra days there were little brightening touches put to it, which made a wonderful difference in the girl's appearance. She had become skilled in many little household ways meantime, and Mrs. Mitchell did not hesitate to pronounce her real downright good help, enough sight better than I had any kind of a notion she ever would be. She is willing to learn, and that's half the battle. She was still very quiet and reserved, speaking plainly her thoughts and feelings to no one but Stephen, whom she always looked upon as her first friend, the one who had protected her unexpectedly from Jake on that terrible midnight of her mother's sickness. Perhaps Stephen listened to her more patiently than to any of the others, because she never spoke to him of himself. Never seemed to realize, indeed, but that he was in all respects what he should be. It was about Jake that she poured out her anxieties. "Why don't you let him alone?" Steve asked her roughly, though not unkindly. "He kicks you about as if you was a toad. I wouldn't stand it. He is just a worthless fellow, too. Why not let him go?" "Oh, I can't, Steve, I can't. There is something here," she laid her hand on her heart, "which tells me to pray for him, and pray and pray. I guess if I knew he was going to kill me, I should pray right on. Steve, it is just an awful thing not to have him saved. He is so bad, worse than the rest, you know, worse than anybody around. I heard a man say last night coming home behind me that Jake Lucas was the worst fellow in the neighborhood for miles around. And it is so, and he ought to be saved, Steve. He could be so easy if he only would." Stephen did not believe this. In his heart he even sneered at the idea of anyone caring whether Jake Lucas was saved or not, and as to it being easy to make a changed man of him, nothing seemed more improbable. "Huh," he said in reply. "I wouldn't pester him about religion if I were you. If the fellow could get sense enough to give up his whiskey and be halfway decent, it would be all I would ask. And enough sight more than I expect," he added in muttered undertone as he strode away. Nevertheless, his conscience troubled him. Had he not been called a champion of the Lucas family? What was he doing to further their interests? For Flora Ann he had begun to have a very friendly, brotherly sort of feeling. He aided her in her laborious studies to the best of his ability, and his ability was steadily growing. Still, he was well aware that Mrs. Colchester, and the minister and his sister, and even Sarah Jane herself, were doing more for Flora Ann than he could. As for the others of the family, he was letting them severely alone. What if he should induce Jake to reform? Not to get religion, he had no confidence in that for Jake, but to sign the pledge and let whiskey alone. "Father did it," he muttered to himself when in severest solitude. "Father has let it alone this many a year, and he didn't sign a pledge either. Jake could stop if he had a mind to, of course. What if there should be a way that I could coax him to do it?" And he half formed a purpose to try at the next opportunity, not without an undertone wish that the opportunity might be long in coming. And this state of mind perhaps any of us who had been hard pressed by conscience can understand, but opportunities are not very hard to find, and very often they come unsought. Stephen's did. Not 2 hours after the conversation last recorded, Jake came lumbering over from the cabin to borrow a hoe. He was more nearly sober than the morning often found him, and he had a vague intention of trying to behave in a respectable manner to people who did not belong to his own family. But if Stephen had been skilled in the study of the human face, he would have known that Jake was very cross, that every nerve was tingling with a desire for the liquor which he had no means of getting. The only thing of which Stephen thought was that here was his chance, a rarer one than had come to him for months, so far as Jake was concerned. If he actually meant business, it ought to be improved. He looked over toward the window of the upper back room which Flora Ann occupied, and strengthened his resolution by remembering the prayer which had floated into him from the cracks in the wall only that morning. "Oh, Lord Jesus, do please save Jake. You know you can if he will let you. Do please do something to make him let you." "Yes," said Stephen, "you can have the hoe if you will bring it back. I want to use it this afternoon. And look here, Jake, if I was you, it appears to me I would turn over a new leaf. Now is as good a time as any." Jake turned upon him the most astonished pair of bloodshot eyes that he had ever seen, but was apparently dumb with amazement. So, taking heart at the silence, Stephen went on. "If you would let whiskey alone, Jake, you could be a decent fellow. People would help you and would help your folks. They need it bad enough, the land knows. It is just because people are discouraged about you that they don't try to do things for the family. Here is your mother, with her sick spells coming oftener, Flora Ann says. She will go in one of them spells yet, and then how will you feel?" Certainly Stephen had made an effort, and done what was his best. Jake still stared at him, but found voice at last to speak distinctly. "If I was you, I would mind my everlasting own business. You are a miserable little puppy that ain't worth the salt you eat on your potatoes, and that get your very clothes out of other folks, begging and fawning and whining around preachers and their set. And then you undertake to turn preacher yourself. You just mind your own business, will you, every time?" And he shouldered the hoe and strode off. None too soon, perhaps, for there was a fierce light in Stephen's eyes, and his muscles were strong and firm. If Jake had known it, his would-be helper had exercised a mighty self-control to keep from knocking him down. As it was, he trembled under the excitement of temptation. He looked after Jake with dangerous eyes, but took no step to follow him. In fact, he stood perfectly still until the excitement had somewhat subsided. Then he said aloud and firmly, "Well, I have done it. Done my level best, and it is the last time. Flora Ann can pray forever, if she is such a fool as to do it, for all I shall try to help. She might as well pray for that stump out there to split itself up into kindling wood. It would never do it, and he will never reform. He don't want to, nor mean to. I have washed my hands of the whole of them." No, he didn't mean Flora Ann. There was a mental reservation concerning her. The truth is, he was separating her in his mind as far as possible from the Lucas family. She was beginning to be classed with the Mitchell family. Then this illogical young man took an axe, and proceeded with strong, powerful strokes to demolish and make into kindling wood the very stump which had served him as an illustration. If he had only understood enough of theology to realize the force of his own worked-out illustration. It was true that the great stump could never make itself into kindling wood, but a power outside of and superior to itself could and did. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Stephen Mitchell's Journey by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. The Wrong Road. Within the week, something occurred which brought Flora Ann home from a visit to her father's cabin, red-eyed and miserable. "Jake's gone," she said to the first person she met as she entered the house, and that person happened to be Stephen. "Jake has gone off. He never came home last night, nor the night before, and Bill says some of the boys saw him get on the train, and he's tooken his things, and he never did that before. He never stayed from home a whole night in his life. Ma says so, and she says her heart is just broke." Whereupon Flora Ann sat down in an utterly forlorn heap on one of the kitchen chairs, and buried her head in her hands, and cried. "A good riddance, I think," said Stephen brusquely. "I shouldn't take on about it, if I were you. Maybe it will be the saving of your mother's life. She couldn't have stood the way he is going on much longer. Didn't you tell me yourself that he kicked her only the last time you were home? And that was the very day that I—" Then Stephen stopped abruptly. He was not going to own, even before Flora Ann, "If any fellow had kicked my mother, I reckon I wouldn't cry because he had taken himself off. Look at your wrist there, all black and blue this minute because he twisted it so the last time you saw him, when you was trying to keep him from kicking your mother, and yet you cry about him being gone. I would have more spirit." "It ain't that," said Flora Ann between the sobs. "But I thought, you see, I thought he would be different. And now he has run away. And the last thing he did was to kick mother, and hurt me, and swear at the little girls. Oh, it is just too awful to think of him gone." "Oh, but he hasn't gone away from God." It was Nina's clear, astonished voice which made this startling announcement. She had come into the kitchen with her velvet tread, a few minutes before, and stopping in dismay to see Flora Ann in tears, had been absorbed in her story. Flora raised her eyes and looked at the child, the misery in her face slowly dying out. "That is as true as a Bible verse," she said at last. "We can't get away from God, can we? I thank you for that, Miss Nina. I will go right straight on praying for him." "I will pray for him too," said Nina, her own eyes full of sympathetic tears. Then Stephen went out, slamming the door a little as he did so. He was vexed with Flora Ann for being "such a fool." It was the evening for prayer meeting in the Mitchell dining room, and Mrs. Colchester, who had heard the story of Jake's disappearance and Flora's grief from little Nina, presented his case for special prayer. It was a prayer meeting to remember. Mrs. Mitchell, having once found voice, had such joy in this prayer circle that it was ceasing to be a cross to spread her wants before the Lord in words which her friends could hear. And she prayed for Jake that night so that his mother's heart at least would have been touched had she heard it. Miranda was there, and cried softly behind the corner of Flora Ann's neat white apron, which had been lent to her to cover certain disreputable portions of her dress. Then Mrs. Colchester prayed, and Helen Ransom, and the minister, all for Jake. Then little Nina, as simply and naturally as though she had been kneeling by her own bedside, bowed her head on her folded hands, and said, "Dear Lord Jesus, please find Jake tonight and save him, and take care of him for his mother and Flora." It was then that Flora Ann's heart broke entirely, and she sobbed out her cry to the Lord for the first time in the hearing of human ears. "Oh, Lord, please do save him. We know you can if he will let you. Oh, please do something to make him let you." Mr. Mitchell coughed a good many times that evening, and used his handkerchief as often for his eyes as he did in any other way. He shook his head when Nina brought him the book for the closing hymn. When she looked wondering and regretful, he bent down and whispered to her that he couldn't sing tonight. Just as the minister was about to offer the closing prayer, an electric thrill went through the hearts of the little company, for Mr. Mitchell was rising to his feet. He took hold of Nina's hand as he said, "Friends, this little girl wants me to tell you tonight that I have begun to pray too, and that I join you in praying for Jake. I have been a good many years finding out that it was the Lord who helped me, but the little girl has shown me the way to him at last. And my poor service, such as it is, I am going to give him for the rest of my days. I thank him tonight for all the way he has led me, though I was blind and didn't know I was being led." Stephen was not there to hear his father's voice. He had taken his lamp early and gone up to his own room, shaking his head in response to Sarah Jane's petition that he would come down in time for the meeting, replying gruffly that he hadn't time for meetings. He had got a tough lesson to get out. In the midst of Sarah Jane's joy over her father was a sigh for her brother. She was very anxious for this young man, who, everybody said, was improving so rapidly. Her daily prayer for him, though perhaps not so heart-rending, was as earnest as Flora Ann's for her brother. The night was a beautiful moonlight one, and as the minister and his sister rode home, they talked about the blessed meeting they had had, and the changes which even a short time had wrought in the Hilton Hill neighborhood. "It is truly astonishing," said the minister, "that we have all been asleep so long. Why, the fields were white for the harvest. Those people listen as if for their lives. I'm sure there were many consciences wrought upon tonight. The stand that Mr. Mitchell has taken is worth a great deal. It is a wonderful thing to see a man of his years come out squarely for the Lord. We have now another proof of the truth that a little child shall lead them." "Hilary has been watching for this for some days," said Helen. "She told me 2 weeks ago that Nina was not going to be satisfied until Grandpa prayed. They have had long talks together, he and Nina. He has asked her a great many puzzling questions which she has brought to Hilary, of course, and, I suppose, has been carefully taught how to answer them, though Hilary says she has been taught of God." "I do not doubt it," said the minister heartily. "Her sister evidently is. I think she is peculiarly a woman who is led by the Spirit." Then the talk drifted toward Jake and the wonderful prayers which had been offered for him that night, and they wondered where on the broad earth he was. "Only the listener to our prayers knows," said the minister. "Isn't it wonderful to think that he carries the sins and sorrows of this great old world on his heart, and hears the cry of every child of his, and treasures up their requests, and brings to pass, through them, human impossibilities? I have faith for even Jake tonight. I don't know how many years it will be before the Lord will find him, but it does seem to me as though those prayers tonight have been answered, and that Jake is to be saved." "That is just what Hilary said," was Helen's jubilant response. "In the hall she put her arms around me and whispered, 'Do you know I expect to meet Jake in heaven?'" "Did she?" said the minister, and there was a very satisfied note in his voice. It gave him, to say the least, a not unpleasant sensation to learn that he and Mrs. Colchester had thought alike. In the meantime, what of Jake? If those who prayed could have seen him at that particular moment, I do not know but their faith would have almost failed them. He was distant 300 miles from his home, on one of the dangerous streets of a large city. He was partially sober for the simple reason that he had failed in securing any liquor since morning. He was cold and hungry and utterly miserable. He had been intoxicated when he left his home, and had continued so during the hours in which he had begged and stolen his way to this point. What his plans had been in going away, even he never knew. A vague idea that sometime he would run away and get rid of the whole pack, as he called his family ties, had possessed him for months. Why he had not carried it into execution before, he could not have explained. Why he selected that particular night for starting, only he who overrules all events can tell. Half an hour before the moment in which we introduce him to you, he had occupied a corner of a downtown omnibus. It was what we call a chance incident which had given him the opportunity. He had been standing at the street corner, more utterly dreary and desolate than he had ever felt in his life. A burning thirst for liquor in his throat, not a penny with which to gratify that thirst, not a spot to go to warm his half-frozen body, not a place where he could get a mouthful of food or a chance to sleep. Perhaps for the first time in his life he had a dim impression that even the wretched home from which he had run away was worth something. Two ladies descended from an omnibus which had drawn up very near the curbstones. As they did so, the string, which confined 2 or 3 bundles in the hand of one of them, broke, and the bundles rolled. It was a wonder that Jake Lucas thought to scoop and pick them up, or thinking, cared to take the trouble. Perhaps he had in his heart a hope that they would reward him. At least, he gathered the packages, brushed off the filth of the street as well as he could, and carried them to their owner. "Poor fellow," she said compassionately, as she offered her thanks. "I haven't a cent of change. Will an omnibus ticket do you any good?" He had smiled cynically as he took the offered ticket. What good would an omnibus ticket do him? But the lady was not out of sight before he decided to make it useful. Why should he not have a ride in the omnibus, since there was nothing else for him to do? It must at least be warmer there than on the street corner, and by the time it had reached the end of its route, it might land him in a part of the city where he could somehow manage to get something to drink. So he hailed a passing omnibus and seated himself in the corner, drawing his hat well over his face. He paid little or no attention to the constantly changing passengers, not even glancing at a middle-aged, well-dressed man, who was quietly, from time to time, passing little slips of printed paper to one and another. He had halted before Jake once or twice, and looked at him doubtfully, but, seeming to decide that the man was too much intoxicated to be approached, had turned away. He was about to leave the omnibus as a couple entered it, a young and elegantly dressed lady, accompanied by a gentleman. The stranger offered his slips of paper to both of these. "What is it?" asked the lady, as they seated themselves, and the seat she had taken was beside Jake. The gentleman laughed. "It is an invitation to the midnight mission, Gertrude. Shall we go?" "Oh, dear!" said the lady, echoing the laugh. "Do you suppose he thought us suspicious-looking characters? I wonder if mine is the same. Yes, it is. Come to the mission to-night and hear the song, 'I was lost, but Jesus found me.' Does that mean us, Charlie? We have been lost, you know. Are you sure you can find your way home now? We are certainly in a part of the city that I have never seen before. Oh, Charlie, mine is a tract on the other side. The most solemn talk you ever heard of. The idea of giving such things out in a public omnibus. What in the world made me take it? I don't want a tract. Do you suppose they ever do any good in that way, Charlie? I believe I will try it. Here, my good fellow, don't you want a tract? You look as though you needed something of the sort." "My dear," said Charlie in warning undertone, as the pretty gloved hand was reached over toward Jake, "don't speak to the fellow. He is intoxicated." "Never mind, he won't hurt me. Take it, my man. If you will read it and do as it says, I have no doubt you will be improved. Oh, Charlie, we are passing the 23rd Street Theater. Now I know where we are. We must take the green line of cars at this corner." And Gertrude Temple gathered her handsome robes about her, and followed her escort from the omnibus, leaving the little tract in Jake Lucas's hand. He had not accepted it. He had simply let it lie passive on his arm, where it had dropped, while he remained lost in astonishment over being addressed by an elegant woman. Presently he took the tract in his thumb and finger, and held it up to the light. When Jake was a little boy, the Lucas family had been almost respectable, and his early educational opportunities had been passable. He could read much better than Flora Ann. The words on the tract were very distinct to him. "Come to the mission on Wilmouth Street tonight, and hear the song, 'I was lost, but Jesus found me,' and get a bowl of hot soup and a good night's rest." Here, then, was his opportunity. The singing he cared nothing for. There was no objection, of course, to their throwing it in, if they were fools enough to do so. But the bowl of hot soup was not to be despised, since he could not get whiskey, and the thought of a place to sleep, to a man who had wandered homeless for 3 nights, was certainly inviting. He wondered vaguely where Wilmouth Street was, and how he was expected to find it. He even muttered a curse on the people who hadn't brains enough to define the locality. Then he turned the tract over, and glanced contemptuously down the other side, where the words were which Gertrude Temple had pronounced solemn. While he was looking at it, the omnibus driver put his head in at the little window, and called, "Wilmouth Street, change cars for Green Avenue." And Jake started up at the sound of the name, and lumbered out again into the night, Gertrude Temple's tract still between his thumb and finger. Now he was in the lowest and most crowded portion of the city. Saloons, gambling houses, and all kindred places of evil resort seemed to have headquarters here. The air was throbbing with the fumes of vile tobacco and viler whiskey. The air was pulsing with oaths. Jake Lucas, only half sober, burning with the desire for whiskey, stumbled on, looking in at the brightly lighted soul traps, the only cheery spots on all that dismal street. They allured him with sight, sound, and smell. He was kept from entering only by the thought that he had no money, and by the knowledge of the fact that such as he would be unceremoniously kicked out of all such places unless money in some form could be produced. He cursed the tract he still clutched in his hand because he could not hope to turn it into whiskey, and stumbled on. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Stephen Mitchell's Journey by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. Reviewing the Road. In due course of time, summer came again to the Hilton Hill neighborhood. And if summer were that sentient creature which poets would have us believe, she would undoubtedly have looked about her in wonder over the changes which one brief year had wrought. There were hints of change all through the neighborhood, but nowhere were they so marked as on the Mitchell farm. Stephen himself, in the midst of his busy life, occasionally took time to look about him with admiring surprise, and contrast it all with but the June before. Not for a single day had Stephen Mitchell lost sight of the new idea which had taken possession of him during that first walk to the Lucas cabin. It was on the way back, while the minister was trying to press upon his attention other and more important concerns, that he had resolved to put all his strength into the old farm and see what would come of it. He possessed certain admirable qualities for grappling with such a task. He had always, from childhood, persevered in his undertakings. The main difficulty in his life having been that he had rarely been offered sufficient inducement to undertake. He possessed also an almost exhaustless patience, so when he was roused and energized by encouraging words, he had put himself into the effort. It had been hard work at first, yet very soon it grew interesting simply to note how many opportunities for acquiring knowledge seemed to open before him. He began to listen to the chance talk which he heard among farmers from time to time, and to discover therefrom how many things could be done on the old farm which had been left undone. It surprised him to learn how many of these things lay within the scope of his own strength. Once realizing that he was worth something in the world, and that he could make a difference in life about him, he bent all his awakened energies to the work. The result was not large in any way, nor remarkable, except to people who had for years let strength run to waste. It meant simply a mended fence here, a mended hinge there, a few lights of glass set in a certain window, a coat of whitewash in some places, a coat of paint in others, a general picking up and clearing up about barnyard and farmyard, and a surprising difference began to manifest itself. People driving by remarked upon it. "The Mitchell place is coming up," they said one to another. As spring opened, and work began with such earnestness as the fields had not known for years, the ever-ready ground responded. The dew and the rain and the sunshine of heaven blossomed things into beauty, and people said, "What has happened to the Mitchells? Their fields haven't looked like this for years." Then there were new things, a strawberry bed over which both Stephen and Sarah Jane, to say nothing of one scarcely less interested, Flora Ann Lucas, had worked and read and studied early and late. The result was ripe berries before any others were heard of in the neighborhood. Potatoes fresh from the ground were on the Mitchell dinner table before their neighbors had thought of its being time to try theirs. Green peas, of a very early and very choice variety, were the next sensation. At a surprisingly early date the Mitchell farm wagon was filled to its utmost capacity with fresh fruits, fresh vegetables, and even fresh flowers, and started on its way to the summer encampment grounds. It is an interesting thing to watch people adjust themselves to altered circumstances and positions. Stephen was only a year older than when he took that ride before, but it seemed to him that he had lived half a lifetime since. So marked were the contrasts. He scarcely knew when it was that his father, instead of saying with authoritative voice and manner, "Go here or there, do this or that," the order always followed by a sigh for his own physical limitations and a groan over probable results, had adopted the fashion of asking, "Shall we get at the potatoes today, do you think?" Or, how had we better plan for the south meadow? Or, what is your idea about that fence on the west side? Only the day before, he had heard the father explain to a neighbor, "Steve thinks we better change the crop entirely on this lot another year. He says the ground needs the change. That it is worn out for the other crop. I don't know how he finds out, but he appears to know about a great many things that I never heard of, and his plans turn out all right. There was a man looking at his strawberry patch yesterday, and he said he didn't know any such strawberries in the country." Doll and Dobbin may not have approved of all the changes, though nothing in their manner hinted at such a thought. They were taken better care of than ever before, more faithfully fed and groomed, but they certainly had to work faster, and loitering, on reasonably good stretches of road, was not permitted in these days. Stephen's start for the encampment was early, and his entire air was the alert one of a man of business. He looked around him curiously as he drove through the enchanted land, fully as beautiful as it had been the year before, and was rather pleased than otherwise to learn that all-important Mr. Baker could not be seen until noon. This gave him a chance to go around to see that remarkable spot where he had first secured his list of words. Apparently the same crowd was there, at least a like crowd in numbers. The platform was occupied, not by the speaker he had heard, but by one who seemed to use language with equal ease. Stephen secured a seat by dint of a little effort, and gave close attention. It chanced, as we are fond of using language, that this was Agricultural Day at the encampment, and the subject of the platform address was one which had an absorbing interest for the young farmer. It was in a line in which he had been reading and studying, and no more earnest or intelligent listener was in that large audience than Stephen Mitchell. Very early in the hour he took notebook and pencil from his pocket, not this time to secure lists of flying words, but to note down certain points which were quite new to him. As he did so, he made the mental resolution to "study them up" to see if that fellow was right. Oh, there was no denying that Stephen had made wonderful progress. He let his mind dwell a good deal upon contrasts this summer day. All the experiences of his first visit were such vivid memories. As he drove homeward his thoughts were busy. Perhaps no small thing marked the changes more forcefully than his stop at the corner store where the same Mr. Pettibone still simpered behind the counter. Stephen did not like him any better than he had the summer before, but he was by no means so afraid of him. He had discovered that Mr. Pettibone was not so grand a gentleman as he had supposed him to be, and that his opinion of persons and things was of comparatively little consequence. He gave his orders with an ease and glibness which contrasted strongly with the green braid experience. Mr. Pettibone's manner was also changed. "How are you, Mitchell?" he had said with friendly familiarity as Stephen entered the store, and as he attended his customers' commissions, he asked if he had been out to the encampment, and whether there were crowds there, and if there was anything "nice" going on evenings. Then, to sharpen the sense of contrast, Miss Ransom entered the store, and her eyes brightened with welcome as Stephen turned to meet her. "How fortunate!" she said. "You are just the one I wanted to see. Can you call at the house a moment? I am anxious to send Sarah a package, and my brother has a package for you, I think. Some illustrated papers which he says make plain those plans for the trellises of which you and he were talking." Stephen even had to call at the Bascoms', not this time to borrow a pattern. Sarah Jane had no need of Bascom patterns in these days. Instead, they were delighted to borrow of her, but to leave a book which Mrs. Colchester had promised Fanny. When he had passed in the morning, it had been too early for the Bascoms. Their house was closed and silent. Fanny was on the piazza when he returned, and her manner pointed the contrast again. She had decided to be very friendly with Stephen Mitchell. Was he not on intimate terms at the manse, much more at home there than she was herself? And there was that elegant Mrs. Colchester. He seemed to be really intimate with her. And Steve really was a nice-looking fellow, now that he wore good clothes and had found out what to do with his hands and feet. Moreover, she had heard Judge Parsons say that young Mitchell was a smart fellow, destined to make a man. She gave him most cordial greeting, and tried to be very cordial. Sent her love to Sarah Jane, and her thanks to Mrs. Colchester, and asked if he wouldn't bring them both out some day to see her flowers. She had some flowers that she knew Mrs. Colchester would admire. It was not so much what she said, as the way she said it, that reminded Stephen forcefully once more of the year before. His smile was half amused, half cynical, as he sprang into his farm wagon and made haste homeward. "She is willing to stand Sarah Jane and me if she can have Mrs. Colchester thrown in once in a while," he said to himself, "but she wouldn't speak to Flora Ann, not for a farm." By which you will discover that Stephen Mitchell, though he had learned many things, had not learned to like Fanny Bascom. It might have been a vague feeling that Flora Ann had been slighted, which made Stephen unusually kind to her that evening. He looked at her thoroughly as she moved around the dining room, putting the finishing touches to the table, which she had learned to do quite as neatly as Sarah Jane herself. He was still in the mood for contrasts. He contrasted Flora Ann not only with the Bascoms, but with the many girls he had seen that day. "She is a pretty girl," was his grave conclusion, "and she is a good girl, and she's going to be a smart girl. In some things she goes ahead of Sarah Jane." It was at that particular moment that the subject of his thoughts stopped in front of the window near which he sat, and looked wistfully down the road. "It will be nice moonlight," she said. "If I can get off early enough, I mean to go home. I am kind of worried about mother. She looked as though she was going to have one of her poor turns the last time I was there, and I haven't seen any of them for more than a week. I could stay all night, you know, and come home real early in the morning." "There is no need of that," said Stephen kindly. "I will go over with you. I would just as soon go as not. I haven't been working today." Within another hour they were walking briskly down the moonlighted road, talking cheerily together. The two had many subjects in common. As a scholar, Flora Ann managed to keep very good pace with Stephen, and she had original ideas upon many subjects which surprised and interested him. His sister did her best to be interested in agricultural studies, but her tastes evidently did not lie in that direction. "She is quick as lightning at grammar," Stephen had explained one day to Mrs. Colchester, "and she is willing to study half the night about flowers. But when it comes to turnips and beets and cabbages, why, you can see she only reads because she thinks it ought to be read. She doesn't take to farming. Now, Flora, if she had a chance, would make a first-rate farmer. She has ideas that surprise me." Mrs. Colchester smiled, and explained that that was an experience common to students. Each had his or her specialty. And she reminded him that if all the world took to farming, there would be no teachers or merchants or preachers. She was always pleased when Stephen said Flora and Sarah, which he was learning to do. She never spoke of the two girls by their full names herself, nor did Nina, and the force of example was exerting itself in the household, even in this respect. "It is very still around here," said Flora, as they neared her father's cabin. "I don't think the boys can be home, or else—" She had no need to finish the sentence. Stephen understood it only too well. The boys, now that Jake was not there to frighten them into silence, were rarely quiet. They were not fierce or dangerous, as Jake had been, but hilarious in a way which was sometimes harder for Flora Ann to bear than Jake's blows had been. She never neared the door of this sorrowful home without thinking of poor Jake. She always spoke of him now with that adjective before his name. But she spoke of him frequently, and made it evident that she had by no means forgotten him. She still spoke more freely to Stephen than to any other person, still apparently continued to believe that of course he felt as she did. "Poor Jake," she said, her thoughts going from the boys to him. "I am praying for him right along steady, Steve. I always will, you know, till I hear he is where he don't need it. Wouldn't it be nice to know that he had got into the right way, and God had taken him where he wouldn't be tempted any more? I would be willing for that. I guess for Mother's sake I would be glad for it. Because, Steve, Mother mourns for Jake all the time. She can't get along without him as the others can. I never go home but she talks about him, and cries, and says she wishes she had borne with him better. Poor thing! She used to bear with him always, only she won't believe it. It was the rest of us that used to be cross to him." "I guess you was never cross to him," said Stephen. "I never saw anything like it." "Well, I wasn't much of anything to him. I was afraid. That was the trouble. It was silly in me to be such a coward. He wouldn't have killed me, I guess, if I had tried to help him more. I wish I had." Then she opened the door leading into the family room, and they went in. It was surprisingly still. The boys were not there. The father was sitting in his chair, drowsing, and partially intoxicated. The little girls had huddled themselves into a corner, and were occupied in staring at a neatly dressed stranger, who sat with his back to the door. "There's Flora Ann!" exclaimed the children, as the door opened. And the stranger arose and came toward them. Behold, it was Jake. Jake, with his shock of black hair neatly combed. Flora Ann never remembered to have seen it combed before. And not only were his clothes whole and neat, but he had on a collar and a necktie. Moreover, his eyes, which had always been bloodshot, were clear and smiling. "How do you do?" he said, holding out his hand, as Flora Ann still stood staring at him. "Surely you have not forgotten me?" "He's come home!" exclaimed his mother, unable to keep silence any longer. "He came this afternoon. I told him we ought to send for you, but there wasn't anybody to send. The boys ain't come yet. Don't he look nice? I wouldn't have knowed him if I'd met him on the street. Oh, yes, I would. I'd know my Jake anywheres. Ain't it wonderful?" But Flora Ann had no words. She was overwhelmed. This to be Jake! This man with a smile on his face! "Things don't match, do they?" he said, the smile deepening. "I don't think they ever will again. I am Jake, and yet I am not Jake. No, I'll tell you how it is. I am a new Jake." Then he turned to Stephen. "How do you do, Stephen? I remember being downright hateful the last words I spoke to you, and I was getting a favor from you at the same time. That was the old Jake. I know you don't lay up anything against him. This new Jake is ashamed of him." Stephen shook the offered hand heartily, but was as silent as Flora Ann. This seemed to him in very deed to be a new Jake, or rather not Jake at all. Remember, he had never seen him when he was not more or less under the influence of liquor. Now there was no sign or smell of it about him. He was thin and pale, and the marks of his hard life showed on his face, but he was quiet, with the quietness of one who had been in the battle and been wounded, but had come off conqueror. They sat late in the evening, listening to his story. He told it from the beginning, described the ride in the omnibus and the gaily dressed, silver-voiced young lady who laid the tract in his hand, told how he had got out into the night and the darkness, and on what sort of a corner he stopped, cursing the tract because it could not be turned into whiskey. Told how the little tract had seemed to lure him on, pointing out soup and a bed, although he would have given the prospect of both for one drink of whiskey. Told how at last he found the mission and the soup, how he was offered a chance to wash and was given some decent clothes and invited in to hear the singing. It was a wonderful story, though it could be put into a few sentences, and the same story is being lived over every night in our large cities. There were men and women connected with that mission who held on to Jake, even though he tried his stupid best to slip away from them, and more than once fell back into the very gutter, only to be sought after and reached after and lured back to the shelter of their care. There were miserable weeks during which Jake came afterward to realize that the workers in the mission had not lost sight of him for one full day. Elude them as he would, and manage in some cunning way to get enough liquor to fire his brain and make him angry at them all, yet would they follow him up and bring him back to that one spot where things were clean and pure, and where food was wholesome and faces were kind. "I cannot tell you about it," said Jake, breaking off in the middle of a sentence. "I don't know how to tell it. I didn't understand what made them hang on to me so. I hadn't a bit of faith in myself. I thought I was about as worthless a fellow as they could find even in that city. And I saw some hard-looking fellows too. But I looked to myself worse than any of them. And I felt worse. I haven't had a very high opinion of myself for a good many years, and I thought it was too late for me to be anything else." But they wanted to hear his story. They plied him with questions, and heard how at last the outraged body and brain refused to endure any more. Fever and delirium followed, during which poor Jake raved and cursed and groaned, and he was watched over and cared for every day and night, faithfully, skillfully, tenderly. Following the fever were long weeks of prostration, during which he lay as helpless as a child. Then he slowly, very slowly, crept back to life and strength again. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Stephen Mitchell's Journey by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. Other Travelers. "And the rest of it," said Jake, breaking off again, a light on his face such as they had never seen there before, "I don't know how to tell. I haven't found any words yet that tell it. There was one day when I felt so low down and miserable that it seemed to me a terrible pity that I had lived. I couldn't see how I was to be of any use to myself or anybody else. I thought I would be just a blot on the earth. I thought of mother here, and it seemed to me that the best news that could have come to her would have been that I was dead and buried. I thought of all of you here at home, and I felt as though there would be more hope for you if I was gone. I didn't see why I had lived. I didn't have a bit of hope for myself. I knew there wasn't any use in trying to be anything but a drunken wretch. Despite of all I had been through, the sickness and everything, there was nothing I wanted so much as whiskey, and I knew that just as soon as I got out on the street where it was to be had, I would find a way to get it. I don't know what made me think of Flora Ann just then, but I did. You see, I knew about her praying for me, and it used to make me mad. But all of a sudden it came over me that there was a God, and that he must have made me, and that I had a sister who had talked to him a good deal about me. I didn't suppose that I believed in prayer, but I seemed to all of a sudden. I was alone, sitting on the side of the bed, and I just slipped down on my knees and said, 'O Lord.' That is every living word I said." To have seen the look of awe on Jake's face as he repeated the word would have been a lesson in reverence. And the reason I can't tell the rest of it is because I don't know what happened. Only he came and took hold of me, and, well, I knew that I wasn't Jake Lucas inside any more. But how can a man tell a thing like that?" Yet Jake must have understood that his face and voice and manner told the story eloquently. He was not even Jake Lucas outside any more. There were other details. He had been very slow in regaining his strength. He had been very much afraid of the streets at first, until he had discovered that the power which had taken hold of him would go along with him through the streets. Having come to himself, or rather having come to God, his next fixed thought was for his mother. But along with the desire to see her, came to him an ambition to present himself before her in such garb as would fit the new man he felt himself to be. With this for an incentive, he had gone to work, almost before his strength was equal to the demand, and had worked faithfully until he had earned a suit of clothes and a little money in his pocket. Then he had started homeward, working his way as he came, stopping at point after point as the necessity for doing so arose, working at anything he could find to do, so that his small sum of money, instead of decreasing, steadily increased. "And so," he said at last, "I've got home." "Yes," his mother broke in eagerly at that point. "And the first thing he did was to buy some tea for me, and he bought crackers and a piece of meat and brought them home. Just to think of my Jake coming and bringing me tea!" Flora and Stephen made almost 1/3 of the distance home in total silence that evening. They seemed unable to find words for their thoughts. At last Flora broke the silence. "It seems too wonderful to believe, doesn't it, Steve? But I don't understand why I should feel so. You see, I have been praying and praying for him and wanting him to come home, yet it seems I didn't expect it. When I found him sitting there all dressed up, and talking so nice and being good to mother, why, I just felt as though I should scream. And one time things got all black in the room, and I was dizzy like, just because I was so astonished. I find I didn't expect any such thing." "I don't wonder," said Stephen. "I wouldn't have been more astonished, it seems to me, if a stick of wood from the woodpile had walked in and sat and talked with us. It is a most amazing thing. It doesn't seem as if he could be Jake Lucas." "He isn't," said Flora Ann, with quiet exultation. "He is made over. Folks aren't the same after they begin to pray, Steve. I know that by myself. I'm not the same girl I used to be at all. Folks don't know it, but I'm not. I don't think the same things about people, nor places, nor doings of any kind, you know. Oh, I ain't a bit the same. I can't describe it, as Jake says, but I understand just what he means. It is all different. Still, there is more difference for Jake than for any of us. Oh my! Think of Jake coming to prayer meeting and praying. Do you suppose he will? I am just afraid I will faint then and miss hearing the words, and I wouldn't for anything." It was fully as wonderful and bewildering as Flora Ann had foreseen. The first time that Jake Lucas came to prayer meeting, the Mitchell dining room was crowded to its utmost capacity, and the hall was full. Even the stairs were full up to the very landing. It was such a strange sight for the neighborhood to see one who had been its terror sitting among them, clothed and in his right mind. He not only prayed, but sang and talked, standing up boldly for the one who, as he always reverently expressed it, had made him over. "You can all see, friends, that I ain't the same," he said earnestly. "I don't think the same thoughts, nor do the same things. Not by a great sight, I don't. I know what has been the matter with me. I have belonged to the devil for a good many years, and I have served him faithfully. Nobody will deny that. Now I have changed owners. No, it isn't that. I didn't do it. Another owner has got me somehow. I don't know how he got me away from the devil, but you can see for yourselves that he has done it. And from this time forth I belong to him, and it makes a difference." As he sat down, Helen Ransom's clear voice took up the story. "I was lost, but Jesus found me, found the sheep that went astray. Threw his loving arms around me, drew me back into his way. I was bruised, but Jesus healed me, faint was I from many a fall. Sight was gone and fears possessed me, but he freed me from them all." The minister came into the manse sitting room one afternoon and found Sarah Jane in earnest conversation with his sister. "Sarah has an application for board," explained Miss Ransom, when her caller had been duly greeted. "Indeed," said the minister, with polite interest. "Who is that?" "A Mrs. Sedgwick," said Sarah. "I have a letter from her. She wants to come for the summer and have her husband come Saturday nights when he can. She says sometimes he cannot get away. She wants to get into the country for her health, and to be near the city where her husband's business is. She offers a very nice price for her board." "That is a good recommendation for her," said the minister, smiling. "How did she hear of you, Sarah?" "She says a friend of hers is a friend of Mrs. Colchester, and told her where she was staying." "What does Mrs. Colchester say?" asked the minister, rousing to deeper interest. "Would she like to have this boarder come?" "I do not think she is anxious to have more company," said Sarah. "She is very busy all the time, and never seems lonesome. But she says of course she wants us to earn all the money we can, and she thinks there is no reason why we should not have this lady come if our rooms will suit her." There followed a detailed discussion of plans carried on by Miss Ransom and her guest. The minister lingered and offered a suggestion now and then, but he chiefly interested himself in the study of Sarah Jane, contrasting her with a girl by that name who had come to them only a year before. He decided that she was a somewhat remarkable study, and felt that he had not realized heretofore that a human being could take such strides in a year's time. "She is a pretty, ladylike girl," he said to himself, "neatly and becomingly dressed. Helen has certainly done wonders for her. She is more changed than her brother in some respects. When one thinks of those 4 people, Sarah, Stephen, Flora, and that marvelous Jake, it is enough to intoxicate one with life. To realize what human effort, supplemented by the almighty power of God, can do for souls, even here on earth, gives one a faint conception of what an eternity of heaven, and the companionship of Jesus Christ, may be able to do for us all." By the time he reached this concluding thought, Sarah's arrangements were perfected. In due course of time the new boarder came to them. "A sickly-looking, fashionable girl," Helen said, describing the newcomer to her brother. "She does not look at all like a married woman, nor act like one. I can hardly understand what the attraction would have been in this direction. She impresses me as one who would be able to cordially hate the country. And there is no more affinity between her and Mrs. Colchester than there is between Sarah and Fanny Bascom." She closed the sentence with a laugh, for both brother and sister realized that comparison could go no farther. "Well," said the minister with a sigh, "if she pays the price for her board, of which Sarah spoke, there will be some compensation at least." The sigh was for a thought which he had, that it would not be so pleasant at the Mitchell farmhouse as it had been. Up to the date when the new boarder was heard of, he had felt that no scheme of Helen's had been happier than this one of setting Sarah Jane to keeping boarders. Since that time he had been occasionally troubled with doubts as to its wisdom. It was 2 weeks before he made the acquaintance of Mrs. Sedgwick. She had come on the Wednesday following the Tuesday evening prayer meeting, which had now become an institution in the Hilton Hill neighborhood. The following Sunday had proved rainy in the extreme, and although Mrs. Sedgwick was said to have expressed a strong curiosity to attend church, she was not inclined to brave a 6-mile ride in the storm in order to do so. On the following Tuesday evening the minister was called miles away in another direction to visit a sick parishioner, and the prayer meeting had to get on without him. In this way 2 weeks had passed. It was on Saturday evening that he came to Helen with a proposition to ride out to the farmhouse. "I have been working very hard," he said, "and I think a canter would do me good. Besides, I hardly ought to have let another Sabbath pass without calling on the stranger. We can make a short call and get home in good season." Sarah Jane saw and recognized them in the distance, and came to the gate to meet them. "I never was so glad to see anyone in my life," she said earnestly. "I have just been praying that Mr. Ransom would come. I didn't know what else to do." "What is the matter?" said Mr. Ransom hastily, recognizing more than cordial greeting in her anxious tone. She made her story brief. Mr. Sedgwick had arrived that afternoon, very much under the influence of liquor when he reached there, and was growing more so every moment, having brought a plentiful supply in his traveling bag. Sarah Jane's eyes were wide with terror. "He has been singing and shouting and acting like a crazy man for the last hour," she explained, "and now he is getting cross. They are in the dining room, and he won't go away himself, nor let her. I think she is scared at him, and he keeps getting so much worse we don't know what to do. If Mrs. Colchester were here, I think she could do something with him. She can with almost everybody. But she went with Flora out to her house. And Steve hasn't got home from the village. So we are just alone. Father don't know anything to do, and he won't go in there at all. He says he would just as soon see a wild tiger as a drunken man. I never saw father act as he does about this." And Sarah Mitchell never understood why her father acted as he did. The loyal wife and son kept always silent about that chapter in his life. "Mrs. Colchester's help should not be expected under such circumstances," said the minister, with more severity than Sarah Jane had ever heard him speak. "Where drunken men are is no place for her. I will go in at once and see what can be done." What he succeeded in doing was presently apparent. His sister and Sarah, waiting outside, heard their voices, the drunken man's loud and hilarious, the minister's firm and commanding. Presently they heard the footsteps of the two making their way upstairs, the drunken man's unsteady and trembling. Evidently he was being half carried, and the minister was speaking quiet, authoritative words. "Put your foot there, Mr. Sedgwick, so. You will not fall. I will see to that. No, you are not coming back. The place for you at present is in your room. You are to get to bed as speedily as possible. Yes, you can. I will help you. Yes, I understand." Interrupting the man in his maudlin attempts at explaining that he had been suddenly taken very sick. "I understand it perfectly, sir. You need not explain." And by this time they had reached the landing above. Sarah Jane drew a long breath of relief. "What a man he is!" she said, meaning the minister, for there was admiration in her tones. "He is like Mrs. Colchester, Miss Ransom. He can do anything with people. They both can. I don't believe he will have a bit of trouble in getting him to bed. And she just coaxed and begged him to go. Miss Ransom, he swore at her. Oh dear, such a time as we have had. And I was afraid Jake Lucas would come in every minute. It would have been awful for Jake to see a drunken man. Don't you think so? Miss Ransom, will you go in and see Mrs. Sedgwick? Maybe you can comfort the poor thing. I suppose her heart is almost broken." "Perhaps she would rather not see a stranger just now," said Miss Ransom, holding back, and wondering what it would be possible to say that would comfort the wife of a drunkard. At that moment the door opened, and Mrs. Sedgwick's pale, pretty face appeared. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Stephen Mitchell's Journey by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. Danger Signals. "Good evening," she said to Miss Ransom. "Wasn't it awful? He never was so bad as that before. He has been with some of those fast men in town who have such a bad influence over him. Isn't it dreadful to think that men will drink and make such awful nuisances of themselves? But they all do it. I don't believe my husband has an acquaintance who doesn't take a glass when he feels like it. They are not drunkards, you know, of course, but once in a while they are overcome. I am sure I wish my husband didn't drink at all, but I suppose he would have to be a minister in that case. I believe they are the only men who do not indulge. You are fortunate in having one for a brother. I think girls ought to look out for such men for husbands. It is a hard life, but there are compensations, it seems." And she actually laughed, this silly little woman. Helen looked at her in dumb dismay. She made no attempt to comfort. She would as soon have tried to comfort a parrot. "I suppose I would better go upstairs," said the wife. "Or would you wait down here until Mr. Ransom gets him to bed? I am sure I have had enough of him for one night. But he will be all right as soon as he gets to bed and has had his first sleep. He will waken in the morning very much vexed with himself, poor fellow. He does dislike making a scene. I assure you, Miss Ransom, this is really a rare occurrence. Gentlemen stay in their clubs in town, you know, when they find themselves overcome with liquor. But in the country, of course, there is nothing for them but to brave the embarrassment. Sarah, I believe I will go up to your room, if you will let me, and wait until Mr. Ransom comes out." And she gathered her silken robes about her, and climbed up the old-fashioned staircase, Sarah and Miss Ransom looking after her, the one almost as much bewildered as the other. Mr. Ransom came down presently, pallid to a degree that startled and frightened his sister, and grave almost to sternness. He was in haste to start homeward. He would not go into the dining room, which between meals had now become the family sitting room. He declined waiting to see Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, who had fled to the kitchen from the presence of the drunkard. He could not wait for the return of Mrs. Colchester and Flora, nor even to see Stephen, with whom he was supposed to have an errand. "Another time would do," he said. He must get home at once. He and Helen had only come out for the exercise. He hurried Helen's last words with Sarah, and in a few minutes they were out, mounted on their horses and galloping toward home. The minister rode at almost breakneck speed, and in the moonlight his face showed pallid still, and his mouth was set in stern lines. Helen wondered, and was silent. He had seen drunken men before. Why was he so moved by this exhibition? Was it sympathy for the foolish little wife, who did not seem to deserve to have such a feeling wasted upon her? "But she must just have talked at random," Helen said repentingly to herself. "Talked to cover embarrassment and pain. She wanted me to think that nothing very terrible had happened, and talked on, perhaps, without realizing what she said. She probably lost her unnatural self-control when she got upstairs. I wish Maxwell would talk. How miserable he looked! If he is going to carry other people's burdens in this intense way, he will wear out long before his time." They were within 2 miles of home before the minister spoke, other than to ask his sister if they were riding too fast and if she were comfortable. But at last he slackened rein and turned toward her. The first words he spoke struck his sister dumb. "Helen, Mrs. Sedgwick is Gertrude Temple." It was even so. The pretty city boarder, who had been willing to bury herself in the country and to offer an extremely liberal price for the privilege of doing so, was the woman who, for one well-remembered year, Mr. Ransom had looked upon as his promised wife. His sister, who had not felt drawn toward the stranger, but rather repelled, and who had struggled with the feeling and chided herself for it as unworthy, now began to study the woman with a strange mingling of feelings, and was obliged to pray much for grace to keep her not only from saying that which might be an injury to others, but also from thinking uncharitable thoughts. Still, the curious problem would present itself. What motive could Mrs. Sedgwick have for coming away from all her home surroundings and home friends, miles into the country? Unquestionably, it was not the love of nature that had brought her. Nature, in its most lovely forms, seemed to be only endured by her, and when it put on its unlovely face, was positively repulsive. Perhaps it was hardly to be expected that a woman like Helen Ransom should have understood a woman like Gertrude Sedgwick. Nothing could be much farther apart than the moral vision of the two. Yet, to those who have come in contact with this type of human nature, Mrs. Sedgwick's motive will be readily apprehended. From very babyhood she had pleased herself. She had been a creature of whims and fancies. She had not for one quiet hour in her life looked ahead and studied the consequences of her acts from the moral side of her being. Results which might be disagreeable to herself she could to a degree apprehend, though even for herself she was very short-sighted. She had married, the winter before, the man whose attentions had first inclined her to feel that she was not fitted to be the wife of a minister. Had Maxwell Ransom been preparing for the bar, or had he been a gentleman of wealth and leisure, she would have decided for him instead of for Charlie Sedgwick. But since she could not move him from his purpose, and since she was able to realize that his profession would demand certain duties from her which would be irksome, the scale had finally turned in favor of the man who was her husband. She was fond of him in her way, but as compared with her pleasure, even the passing pleasure of an hour, he was altogether secondary. She had lived fast after her marriage, without regard to the laws of health or to any laws save those which her fancy dictated. She had treated her body as a mere machine whose business it was to do her bidding. Of course it had taken but a few months to break down a body which was never strong at its best. When the physician had ordered rest, and entire freedom from the requirements of fashionable life, Mrs. Sedgwick had looked about her for some entertainment, and in doing so had heard of Mrs. Colchester's departure from the city. "Have you heard of our beautiful young widow's latest freak?" That was the way the news was communicated. "It has suited her fancy to go into the country in midwinter and bury herself and her little sister in a farmhouse." "There is some special attraction, you may depend upon it," Mrs. Sedgwick had said as soon as she heard this story. "Mark my words, Mrs. Sylvester, you will hear of some interesting young man stranded in the vicinity of that country farmhouse before the season is over." This explanation was met with approval by some of the circle, and with indignation by others. A thorough discussion of Mrs. Colchester's affairs had followed, but Mrs. Sedgwick, caring not in the least for either side, had forgotten all about it until the conversation was recalled to her a few days later by Mrs. Sylvester. "You are evidently right about Mrs. Colchester, my dear Mrs. Sedgwick. I am told that there is a brilliant young clergyman where he has gone, who has one or two protégés in the aforesaid farmhouse, and is therefore a frequent visitor. One may always trust young widows to keep their eyes wide open." "It speaks well for her husband that she is willing to choose another from the same profession," was Mrs. Sedgwick's gay rejoinder. "What is the name of the clergyman who is brilliant enough to hold people in the country through March?" "Why, that is an interesting part of the story. His name is Ransom, Maxwell Ransom. He is a nephew of the famous professor by the same name, and has inherited all his uncle's talent, I am told." Mrs. Sedgwick had received this piece of information in utter silence, but had pondered over it to such purpose that later in the season, when she was ordered to the country, she could think of no other part of the world where she could be induced to go save to the Mitchell farmhouse. No, you are not to think of her as the wickedest woman on the face of the earth, but simply as a weak, vain woman who desired to amuse herself. She could not help feeling that it would be amusing to come in contact with Maxwell Ransom, and bring her fascinations to bear upon him once more. It would really be very exciting to meet him again and talk over old times, even sigh a little over the memories of the past. Where was the harm? They had had delightful times together. She frankly admitted to herself that in some respects he was Charlie's superior. She had always thought so. There had been times when she had frankly told Charlie that if she had married Maxwell Ransom, he would never so far have forgotten himself as to drink enough liquor to make him either silly or cross. No, it was entertainment pure and simple which Mrs. Sedgwick was after. She felt herself somewhat defrauded of entertainment at times, for her husband's temptations were such as to make her more or less nervous in society, and now her failing health had come to aid to the inconveniences of life. It was but fair that she should get what enjoyment she could out of banishment, and where could more be found than in the society of a young man whom she knew so well, and with whom she could talk freely, and associate familiarly without being misunderstood? For he was a clergyman, and she was a married woman. This was really the extent to which her shallow little brain had planned, and Helen Ransom, in studying her, did not do her justice. Perhaps one of her nature was not able to do justice to so small an amount of brain as had been given to Gertrude Sedgwick. The minister, as soon as he reached home, went directly to his study, and was seen no more that night. The next morning he was himself again, possibly a trifle paler than usual. He admitted to his sister that he was late in retiring. But he was as deeply interested in his work as he had been the day before, and entered upon it with energy. Nor did he change his habits in the slightest degree in regard to the Hilton Hill neighborhood. He went regularly to the meetings, and made his regular calls quite as usual. Helen, who always accompanied him on these trips, watched with anxious eyes, but could not see that he treated Mrs. Sedgwick in the slightest degree differently from what he would any stranger whom chance had brought in his vicinity. As the weeks passed, Mrs. Sedgwick also made this discovery, and it is unnecessary to confess that it annoyed her. Mr. Ransom, as a theological student, had been wont to flush and pale under her influence, to try in every way in his power to please her, to put himself out to gratify her whims. But it was only too apparent that this Mr. Ransom, while perfectly courteous at all times, was also perfectly indifferent as regarded herself. He never sought her society nor shunned it, and the weak little woman who liked her husband less and Mr. Ransom more every time she saw him, and who knew, or thought she knew, that it was Mrs. Colchester who had come between them, as she expressed it to herself, grew every day more determined to win the attention she coveted. Or, failing in that, at least she would prevent their enjoyment of each other. It was not in Gertrude Sedgwick's nature to stand tamely by and see Mrs. Colchester accomplish what she could not. It was a lovely afternoon in early autumn, and the Mitchell farmhouse, which had taken on many improvements during the summer, was bright with sunshine and gay with many autumn flowers. In Mrs. Colchester's room, that lady, with Helen Ransome and her brother and Sarah Jane, were having what the latter called a first-rate visit. It was Tuesday, and Mr. Ransome and Helen had come out early, as they always did on that day, to make a call or two in the neighborhood, take tea at the Mitchell farm, and get ready for the evening meeting, which meeting was so growing in interest and power since Jake Lucas had taken hold of it, that people drove for miles in various directions in order to see and hear this marvelous specimen of what God could do. He was so earnest in securing allies for his new master that he let no opportunity pass without urging upon people, just to try him and find out for themselves. They had been talking together about Mrs. Sedgwick. "I invite her to my room as often as I can," Mrs. Colchester had said, "because I am very sorry for her. She is an unhappy woman. She is not gaining in health, and her husband is not improving in his habits. He was worse at this last visit than we have ever seen him. Of course, she feels very anxious about him, with an anxiety which cannot be spoken of. It seems to make her nervous even to hear his name mentioned. I don't know how she bears her burden, and she is trying to bear it all alone. I know," in response to Helen's inquiring look, "she is a member of the church, but I think the first principles of vital Christianity are yet to be learned by her. And she is so hard to reach, because she takes it for granted that she is on safe ground, of course. Hasn't she been a church member in good and regular standing ever since she was 14? I am afraid for such people. It seems to me they are in far greater danger than those who reckon themselves outsiders." End of chapter 27. Chapter 28, the final chapter of Stephen Mitchell's Journey by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28, the through line at last. It was at that moment that Mrs. Sedgwick had entered the room, and Mr. Ransome, who had been a listener to this talk, which was rather between Helen and Mrs. Colchester, after greeting the newcomer, had moved away and taken up a book. Not to read, but as a cover for his thoughts. Was it his duty to assume more friendly relations with Mrs. Sedgwick in order to try to lead her into the right way? He admitted to himself that probably Mrs. Colchester was right, and there was little hope that this woman, whom he had once thought such a lovely Christian, understood the first principles of personal religion. Was it his duty to try to help her? Would he not be misunderstood? But even if he were, would that relieve him from his duty? And the minister's mind was in chaos. It ended by his joining the little circle, summoned thither by a question which Mrs. Sedgwick called out to him. For a few moments the conversation was general. Then Sarah, being called from the room, presently returned and petitioned Miss Ransome to come out to the dining room a few minutes, and the three were left together. Whether the spirit of maliciousness took hold of Mrs. Sedgwick to an unusual degree that afternoon will not be known. Certainly she became very personal in her words. "This is almost like old times, isn't it, Max? Dear me, what a little time ago it seems when you and I used to be very much pleased when people were called out of the room. Do you remember that Friday evening at the seminary, when the girls would all stay down in the parlor? I suppose I ought to say Mr. Ransome, but it sounds very much more natural to me to call you by the name I am used to. Mrs. Colchester, we are amazing you, are we not, by our reminiscences? You did not know that Mr. Ransome and I were very, very old friends, did you?" I am a very new friend of Mr. Ransom," said Mrs. Colchester with a quiet smile, "and therefore have no knowledge of his friendships of long standing, of course." "No, and our friendship was not of a character to be published, was it, Max?" "I know no reason, Mrs. Sedgwick, why you should not state to any one whom you choose that we were formerly very intimate friends, if it please you to do so." The minister's tone was cold as ice, and his manner dignity personified. It made Mrs. Sedgwick feel more wicked still. Evidently she was not gaining any influence over him. Then she would sacrifice him to her jealous disappointment. It had been disappointment from the very first. She had gone angrily over it in her mind only that day, and told herself what a fool she had been for her pains. How carefully she had guarded the secret of her former acquaintance with Mr. Ransom on her first arrival, in order that she might enjoy the excitement of his and their surprise when they should learn who she was. And behold, the first meeting had been when he came to help her drunken husband to bed. How hard, even after that, she had striven to get a little excitement out of it, by being only an innocent child before Helen Ransom, in the belief that her brother had been too much overcome to explain who she was. It had been but another disappointment. "Certainly I know you were once Miss Temple," Helen Ransom had said one day when Gertrude had resolved to make the revelation. "I have known you since the first evening my brother called here after you came. It was quite natural, of course, that he should mention it." And she had spoken as though it were a matter which had no interest for her, nor for her brother. At that time the lady had concluded that her story was well known to Mrs. Colchester, for of course Helen Ransom had told it. This was Mrs. Sedgwick's idea of friendship. But later, when she came to know Helen better, she had a shrewd suspicion that utmost silence concerning her had been maintained. When she made the resolve to sacrifice Mr. Ransom, she rejoiced over this. She laughed the little girlish laugh that used to be so sweet to Mr. Ransom's ears. "Dear me, Max, don't be so fearfully dignified. What is the use? You remind me forcibly of the times when some escapade of mine used to disturb you. I have received many a curtain lecture from him, Mrs. Colchester. I used to be a sad trial to him, I suspect. He owes me a vote of thanks for refusing to victimize him all his life. What a queer minister's wife I should have made! Can you imagine me for 1 minute in such a position, Mrs. Colchester?" "No," said that lady with a grave smile, "not with your present views of life." "That is just the trouble. My views of life were always at variance with the life which was planned for me. And they are yet, for that matter. I think life has treated me in a very niggardly fashion. Here I am, an old married woman, sick and miserable, when I ought to be just a girl, enjoying myself. But I will try to do my duty, Mrs. Colchester, and I warn you that this gentleman is very set in his ways. He is a slave to a creature which he calls duty, but which is really only another name for self-will. He will not hesitate to sacrifice any and everything which comes in the way of it. Oh, don't I know all about it? I am one of the sacrifices. But, my dear, I don't think you need to blush so over my revelations. Having been a married woman, you know men, of course. They are all alike, fickle, I dare say. Some of them think more of books, it is true, than they do of any woman, even before marriage. But I assure you Mr. Ransom is quite attentive for him. Of course, it is most apparent that you are the attraction to this old farmhouse, and you may as well enjoy it while it lasts. It is the only way to get along with life." Said Mrs. Colchester, "Nina, dear, do not try to get out of the swing alone. Wait, I will come to you." And she stepped from the doorway near which she stood, out on the piazza, and moved swiftly off toward the swing under the great old trees. Mr. Ransom was left alone with Gertrude Temple. She lifted her eyes to him, and actually they were full of tears. "Oh, Max!" she said, and her voice had the old childish quiver in it which used to move him. "Have I offended you? Have I been very hateful? I did not mean to be. I do not know what I say half of the time. I talk lightly to other people, but really, Max, life is very hard upon me. You do not know what I have to suffer, and it hurts me so to think that you who used to be so entirely my friend should seem to—" Then she stopped, her beautiful eyes all dim with tears. She might as well have attempted to move a marble statue with tears and tremulousness. Mr. Ransom had risen from his chair the moment Mrs. Colchester left the room, and moved to the doorway through which she had passed. His voice was cold and stern. "You have done no harm, I imagine, Mrs. Sedgwick, except to yourself. A woman who can forget herself and her husband, and speak as you have done just now, is to be pitied perhaps even more than she is to be blamed." Then he, too, went through that open doorway, and walked deliberately out to the swing under the old trees. In the near distance was Stephen Mitchell, riding in from the field on a load of corn. He shouted to Nina, and she ran gaily away to ride up the long lane by his side. Her sister stood looking after her, her fingers engaged the while in breaking little twigs from the great tree, her face averted from Mr. Ransom, and her whole manner showing that she was struggling for an outward calm which would have belied the tumult in her heart. "Mrs. Colchester," the minister said, speaking in quick, firm tones, "you have heard several truths this afternoon. You may not be interested in any of them, yet it becomes me as a man to own them as truths. I was engaged to be married to Mrs. Sedgwick, as she has intimated. I did not desert her as she hints. Instead, she deserted me. I would have been true to what I thought she was had she given me opportunity. It is a long story which you may not care to hear. It rests with you to say whether you care or not. She spoke other words which are also true. Among them, that I am drawn to this house in order to see you. I have known it for some time. I have hoped that the time might come when you would let me tell you so, when you would let me explain everything which has to do with my life. I had not meant to come to you in this abrupt, almost rude fashion, and assuredly I had not meant to subject you to insult because of me. As it is, I hardly know what I ought to do next. You would be justified in wishing me to leave you, yet I cannot feel willing to do so without an effort at explanation. I am so hurt and grieved that through any influence of mine, however remote, you should have been exposed to the venom of a cruel tongue, that I find myself unable to decide what would be the least offensive course for me to pursue under such strange circumstances. There was silence under the trees for what seemed to the minister hours of time, though it was in reality but moments. Then Mrs. Colchester gave him a view of a very sweet face and eyes that smiled. He had never heard a gentler voice than the one which said, "My trust in you is not shaken, Mr. Ransom. I give you leave to tell me as much or as little of your past as you choose, whenever you will. And I am not angry at that poor woman. It is as she said. Life has used her hard, or rather she has used it hard, and there is bitterness in store for her. When I think of the contrast between her life and mine—" Her voice broke, and it was a moment before she added, "I have only pity for her, Mr. Ransom." They lingered under the trees, sitting down together on the rustic seat which Stephen had made. Nina danced back from her ride, and finding them unsatisfactory company, flitted away again, and went to help Sarah and Flora arrange a most delightful-looking tea-table. In her room upstairs, Mrs. Sedgwick watched the two under the trees with angry eyes, and brushed away from time to time certain miserable tears, and said to herself over and over again, "What a wretched idiot I have been all my life!" Downstairs, Helen Ransom sat alone, taking neat stitches in the bit of work she was doing, and giving satisfied glances occasionally out of the window. She liked the picture under the trees. In due course of time, Nina summoned them all to that delightful tea table. "Helen," Mr. Ransom said, as they rode home that evening after prayer meeting, "did you ever tell Mrs. Colchester anything concerning Mrs. Sedgwick and myself?" "Maxwell!" It was the only answer he received, but he needed no other, and made haste to respond, "I beg your pardon, Helen, but you are friends of such long standing, and so very intimate, I thought possibly—" "Max, do you think that long and very intimate friendship justifies breaches of confidences made by other friends?" "Certainly not. Forgive me. I have never thought that you did, or could do other than that which was true and noble. It was only my awkward way of introducing the subject. I have told her myself, the whole story, and I have something to tell you. Not about Mrs. Sedgwick. Poor creature, I find I can only feel pity for her. I have not even the heart to be indignant with her tonight, though assuredly she gave me cause this afternoon. Helen, I know it will make you glad, but will it surprise you very much to hear that your friend has promised to be your sister?" It was 3 months afterward, on a moonlighted winter evening, that Stephen Mitchell and his pastor were walking across lots from the Lucas home, where they had been spending the evening together under circumstances the most solemn that human experience knows. Old man Lucas, as he had been known in that neighborhood for so many years, had but just exchanged worlds. The marvel of marvels had taken place once more. The old, worn body, dimmed of sight, dulled of hearing, poisoned with rum and tobacco, abused and wasted beyond repair, had been left behind. The soul, stained so many years with sin, having breathed out through lips of clay curses innumerable upon its Maker, having done almost all that a soul can do to make wreck of its possibilities, had toward the closing of that solemn 11th hour given heed at last to the voice which had steadily called after it. Those waiting around the old man's bed had heard the sin-stained lips speak marvelous words, even these: "God, for Jesus Christ's sake, has forgiven my sins." At the very last, when they had thought him done with earth, the dimmed eyes had opened again and looked upward for a moment. The thin, pale lips had taken on the majesty of a smile, and once more formed the words, "God, for Christ's sake, Amen." And old man Lucas had gone. "What a wonderful experience!" said Mr. Ransom, as he crushed the frosted snow under his feet. "What a privilege has been ours tonight! Think what an infinite Saviour is ours, to take that man with his load of 70 years of sin upon him, and put a new song in his mouth, and stamp the clay that he has left behind, with such a look of a conqueror that his children stand about it in awe, saying, 'Can that be Father?' What a thing it must be for that man to enter heaven!" They were crossing the Mitchell farm now. It lay under the snow, but both men thought as they trod of the golden harvest that had waved there but a short time before; of the golden returns, very unusual both in quality and quantity therefrom. Stephen Mitchell was going to be a farmer. Nobody questioned it now. Even in so short a time he had made his mark. Even in so short a time his father had learned to say, "Ask Steve about it. He does the planning. Steve knows what he is about." Even in so short a time they had learned at the market in the city to ask for berries and early vegetables, yes, and even flowers, from the Mitchell farm. Oh, yes, Stephen's heart was in it. The way he worked, and the way he studied, and the way he planned, proved that. But the minister thought of it all sadly. He remembered their first walk together across those fields, and the mistake he was convinced he had made. Why had he started Stephen Mitchell's energies, ambitions, hopes, and plans all earthward? Even while he thought and sighed, Stephen broke the silence. "Mr. Ransom, something else has happened today that you don't know about yet. I have boarded the right train at last, sir." "What is that, Stephen? What do you mean?" "I mean that I have been running on a sidetrack for the last year or so. It has been a pretty good road, as you know, in some respects, but you haven't been satisfied with it. I know that, and I haven't been real downright satisfied myself, though I tried to think it first class. But I have changed roads now. I am on the main line at last, and am bound for home. I'm not a passenger either, but a stockholder." "The Lord be praised!" said the minister, the joy in his heart ringing in his voice as the full meaning of this quaint language dawned upon him, and he grasped Stephen's hand. "I have waited and prayed for this so long, Stephen. Do you mind telling me the story, what started you on the right road at last?" "Well," said Stephen, clearing his throat, "I have been thinking about it a good deal more than any of you know. But I really suppose it was Jake Lucas at the last who got me on the main track. It seemed so remarkable for him to board the lightning express, as you may say, and me, with the long start I had ahead of him, to be left behind. Then he was determined I should travel with him. It seemed as though nothing less would satisfy him. Then, perhaps you remember that list of words which started me in the first place?" "I certainly do," said the minister promptly. "Well, I keep studying them. I made up my mind, you know, to master them, and they brought me square up against the Bible one day, and made me go at that if I meant to be honest." There was a moment's pause, then Stephen cleared his throat and continued. "There's another thing, to be downright honest. I found out that Flora had taken me in place of her brother, and was praying for me every day in the same way she used to for him before he started. And she has had such a hard life, one way and another, I couldn't seem to want to disappoint her." The minister told this story over to Mrs. Colchester not long afterward. "So it was Jake, and the list of words, and Flora Ann who reached him, you see," he concluded, and there was the faintest little sigh in his heart as he said the words. He had prayed so long and worked so earnestly for Stephen Mitchell. "Well, what matters it?" he added, "so that he is on the main line at last. It is of very little consequence who took him to the train." Then, after a moment's silence, he laughed. "I remember he told me once he thought something might be made of that Flora Ann, if the right person could only get a hold of her. And I really think, Hilary, the right person to help her all through her life has been found." End of chapter 28. End of Stephen Mitchell's Journey by Pansy. Recorded by TriciaG, September through December 2020. Thanks for listening.